Well, thank you all for coming again. Thanks for your interest in this topic. Maybe Brian didn't notice that this is, of course, La Giustizia. And here are the virtues. I think that's magnanimity and so on, from the very painting by Lorenzetti, which is on the town hall, on the wall of Il Comune in Siena. We didn't plan this, by the way. Here, at the same time, this was just a decade or so before this painting was done, a statement from the Constitution of Siena: the city must be governed by men who love peace and justice. So probably I soaked up part of that tradition, having been lecturing there for the past 30 years and having gotten quite interested in early modern political thought, partly as a result of that. Now, because I have these very critical respondents coming up, actually, I should tell you how this happened. I got a very critical email from one of them, and I thought it was so interesting that I thought, gosh, let's talk about that. You can guess which one it was. It'll probably be, I hope it'll be the most critical of the four, because it was pretty critical. So I decided I'd better clean up my act and sort of defend myself in advance. Well, the first thing is the poster that you've all seen, which is very beautiful. That's not Florence. That's obviously a Canaletto, and it's a painting by Canaletto, and it's obviously St. Mark's, Piazza San Marco in Venice. It's not even Siena. But then there's another problem. What about the title? This has also been criticized in other emails. I mean, it's a knockoff title. I mean, for example, it's just this Adam's fallacy. I mean, I'm borrowing it obviously from my dear friend, a very good economist, Duncan Foley. Or what about Descartes' error? I mean, it's been taken already. Or, you know, there are other books, you know, which have similar sounding titles. So I'll have to correct all of these things, the paintings, the title, and everything. In previous episodes, there's been a lot that we talked about, beginning with the quote, which you see before you, from the discourses of Machiavelli, departing from what's called the Aristotelian tradition. I gave you some evidence from Accra, Ghana, that actually it may be true that market-like incentives may drive out religion and make people less generous as a result. I talked about Hume's idea that constitutions should be designed as if individuals were knaves. I talked a little bit about the evidence about cooperativeness and incentives. The Boston firemen who all called in sick when the commissioner imposed incentives to prevent them from calling in sick, and he docked their pay. This is a guy who's a fisherman in Brazil. In the public goods game, the ones who played very cooperatively in the public goods game also turn out to be very green-minded fishers, and they used nets with very small mesh, very large mesh, so as to let the little fish out, and so on. I mentioned Adam Smith. We'll come back to some of his ideas as well. Now, the idea of Machiavelli's mistake is this: the idea to which I say is mistaken, and which is only, with some stretching, attributed to anything like Machiavelli, but rather to a tradition which I think he had a hand in starting, was this: material incentives can implement socially desirable outcomes irrespective of individual preferences. So civic virtue may be dispensed with almost entirely. Almost is because of the proviso about, well, who's designing these incentives? After all, they cannot be exempted from the requirement of virtue. I've argued that it's mistaken, first, this is the subject of the first lecture, because these incentives on which the dominant paradigm is based may crowd out the social preferences. I call it the idea of this non-crowding out. The crowding out would not occur, that the social preferences and self-interested preferences or material preferences could be additive. I called the separability assumption, and I showed lots of evidence from experiments and also from real life that probably fails. Now, here I want to say, I want to return to the topic of why it is that social preferences are essential. The fundamental reasoning is that the contracts which regulate our activities, in many areas there aren't even contracts, but even where we have the contracts are incomplete. They're either non-enforceable or they don't cover everything that we care about. And sometimes in the presence of incomplete contracts, we try to design mechanisms, is what it's called in economics, that is incentive systems, which will implement these outcomes which are desirable. And I want to convince you that these are insufficient to ensure a good solution to the kinds of problems which we face. One of the reasons for that, which I won't develop here, but which I think is an interesting idea, which I would like to develop a bit, is that mechanism design, as it's been developed, is actually a very poor idea in a very liberal society. And the reason is, if you read carefully the fine print of these highly mathematical papers, they rely heavily on very large penalties and on acquiring information. Most of the ways of acquiring information, there are one or two exceptions to this, would violate ordinary notions of privacy. The very large penalties, we used to call them debtors' prisons, or whipping slaves, or perhaps inflicting physical harm on people for economic malfeasance. It's no longer acceptable to do that, thankfully. But it does suggest that many of these incentive systems, which are said to be part of giving the invisible hand a helping hand, would be absolutely anathema in a liberal society if they were taken seriously. Now, these are the reasons why I think this view at the top is mistaken. In the second lecture, I raised the obvious question, which is, well, if this top thing is true, if the crowding out phenomenon is true, it could very well be that the institutions that liberals advocate are self-destructive in the sense that they're dynamically unstable because they don't reproduce the values upon which their functioning depends, and I showed that that is probably not true. In this lecture, then, I want to ask what the sophisticated legislator should do. The sophisticated legislator is the one who knows this stuff, and believes it, and thinks it's true, knows all these experiments, and now has to design incentives that don't have these counterproductive effects, which I've talked about, the examples being the Boston firemen and so on. So I'll be talking about the two things in the boxes here. Now, why is it important that we do this? I just actually wrote this slide this morning because I wanted to tell you why I'm doing this. Why am I writing this book? Well, I should say I've been working on it for 20 years. Did I tell you that in the first lecture? My first paper on this topic was written in 1988. I presented it in the philosophy department of the University College London in 1989. I thought it was a good idea, but I thought it was a pretty weak paper, and so I sat on it for almost 20 years until I actually had a little more information on the topic. This has been a very abiding topic with me, and the reason is this. I'm having second thoughts about whether prices can do the job of morals, which is, this is Mandeville here, by the way, where he said, human frailties may be turned to the advantage of civil society and made to supply the place of moral virtue. That's the topic that's the assertion which I find extremely dubious, given the kinds of problems which we face today. Okay, real world economics. This is no longer an economy of grain and steel. Forget the covers of economics textbooks which have smokestacks and fields of grain. That's not what's going on anymore in the economy. We're an economy which is based on the production of knowledge, information, distribution of that, but also we're living in a world in which our well-being depends importantly on such things as infection, political violence, global warming, and so on. These are things which are quintessentially those aspects of social interactions that can never be enforced in a complete contract. So I want to convince you, or at least I want to tell you what I think about this, that we're moving into an economy in which whatever was said about the invisible hand and the possibility of having more complete contracts, and that's solving our problem in the economy of grain and steel. It's unlikely to be true in the economy of the future, what is called perhaps indicating its difficulty of its intangible nature, the weightless economy. It's unlikely to work for that, and that being the case, we're going to have to rely on people's moral orientations or social preferences to a considerably greater extent in the future than in the past. The way I remember this, it's an economy of handshakes, not of peace rates. In economics, as you may know, we treat working as if it was a matter of piece rates. We don't even ask why people work as hard as they do or not. We act as if they're paid by the number of shirts they produce in many textbooks. Well, you know, piece rates are probably about now something like 3% of the labor force work for piece rates in the American economy. It's just that kind of ability to measure what's going on is not what's a part of the economy today. Now, Adam Smith said the self-interest of the butcher and the baker would put the dinner on the table, and I believe that. And I believe that well-defined property rights and competition on markets will accomplish that for the things that are going to be put on the table. However, I don't believe that the problems I mentioned above can be handled in the same way, and I think they will require a decent amount of combination of incentives and what I'll call, in an anachronistic way, civic virtues to solve the problem. Now, many of you know about, some of you may have read this book, The Gift Relationship from Human Blood to Social Policy. It was written in 1971, and in it, Titmuss said that if you pay for blood, essentially you don't get a good blood donation program. He's contrasting America and England. Interestingly, two of the most famous economists in the world, Ken Arrow and Bob Solow, wrote reviews of that book, long reviews. They took it very seriously, but at the end of the day, they said they didn't think it was true, there was some reason to doubt that it was true. First, there was little evidence that the what I call social preferences, these other regarding or ethical preferences, were at all common. I mean, obviously, sociologists and anthropologists thought they were, and economists and biologists knew that they weren't, and that's about where the matter stood, until we got a very large number of experiments suggesting that, in fact, in most subject pools around the world, those preferences are, in fact, very common. Now, there was even less evidence that the use of these incentives would actually crowd out these social preferences were they to exist. In fact, there was very little at all, and there certainly was very little in the book by Titmuss. And finally, in 1971, we were pretty confident that was then called the new welfare economics and came to be called mechanism design and so on. We were quite confident that we could design these mechanisms where to implement a socially desirable, efficient outcome for the economy on the basis of these clever incentives where the market failed. Now that's all changed. Mechanism design has grown tremendously, and we found its limits. We know a lot more about human preferences. Now another thing happened more recently. What is called, to those of you who study macroeconomics, it's called the Lucas critique. And Lucas raised a very obvious question. He said, look, when we design macroeconomic policies, we trust that individuals in this society have certain beliefs about what's going to happen, and then we introduce a policy taking account of those beliefs. But what happens if the policies affect the beliefs? He was talking about unemployment and inflation. This immediately rocked the policy-making establishment in economics because it was so obviously true. If the policy alters what people think, you've got to make the beliefs endogenous when you design a policy. So what I'm suggesting here is exactly similar to the Lucas critique, those of you from economics. It's an idea in which we should make the preferences endogenous. We should look at the effect of the policy on the preferences and then study the outcome. Well, the key to studying that outcome must be some kind of equilibrium. Notice, with Lucas, the beliefs were taken to be dynamic. They depended on the policies. I want to urge you to think about the preferences as being similarly dynamic so that there's some kind of equilibrium between the policy interventions and the preferences, whereby the preferences will be technically stationary. That is, you take account of where they'll move in response to the tax rate or the fine or the fee and so on. Okay, so here's where the sophisticated planner might start his reading. After I published the paper surveying this, Tom Schelling wrote me this email. Can you read it? Maybe not. Yeah, particularly if you can have one of those spots on me. So, okay, if you turn the lights down for this slide, after all. Okay, so this is, I'll just read it. This is Schelling in the White House in the early 50s. Those were exciting and stimulating times. People worked long hours and felt compensated by the sense of accomplishment, and I believe a sense of personal importance. Regularly, a Friday afternoon meeting would go on until 8 or 9, when the chairman would suggest resuming Saturday morning. Nobody demurred. We all knew it was important, and we were important. Sometime in '52, I believe it was, President Truman issued the order that anyone who worked on Saturday was to receive overtime pay. What happened? Saturday meetings virtually disappeared. Could you turn the lights back up? This is a little too mysterious for me. Thank you. He thought that this crowding out, non-separability phenomenon was what was going on there. Or here's David Packard talking about the founding of Hewlett-Packard and what he learned from his bad days at General Electric. General Electric was making a big thing of plant security, guarding its tool and parts bins to make sure employees didn't steal. Employees set out to prove this obvious display of distrust justified walking off with tools and parts. When HP got underway, I determined that our parts bins and storerooms would always be open, and so on. It was important in two ways. Easy access to the parts it helped product designers and others who wanted to work on new ideas at home and on weekends. And open bins and storerooms were a symbol of trust. Trust was a central way to how HP does its business. Now notice this is interesting because these individuals were working at home. They were doing extra work. And this sign of distrust would not only make it impossible for them to work at home, but presumably make them a little less interested in this. Or consider the following. I love this one. Okay, there's this tax collector somewhere in Andhra Pradesh in India, and he's having a hard time getting the taxes collected. So what does he do? He hires 10 drummers to go out and beat their drums outside the houses of the people who are not paying their taxes. And they pay up like crazy. And his idea is, of course, that they're ashamed. Everyone knows when the drummers show up at your house that you're a deadbeat taxpayer. Of course, this reminded me of charivaris in early modern Europe. It may have predated that, but in many countries of Europe, a miscreant, either a womanizing husband or a price gouging baker or some grandee who was exploiting his noble titles and so on, would be greeted by a large group of people coming to his home. They were mostly women usually, beating pots and pans and generally drawing attention to his low moral character. All right, so these contrasts tell us something about the range of interventions that you might think about. Okay, so the sophisticated legislator first has to think about this problem. How do I design institutions so that incentives are synergistic with ethical and other regarding preferences? That is, how do we make them so they crowd in? They're complements rather than crowding out. They're substitutes. Then having done that, we have to think about what's the optimal level of the incentive, of the tax or fee or whatever it is, if you're going to use one at all. Now, by the way, this optimal incentive argument is a big literature in economics. It's called optimal taxation. It's in the old days. Now, the first task, how do you design institutions so that incentives have these complementary synergistic effects, is it immediately runs into a problem, and that's that situations which look very similar, fines or incentives seem to have opposite effects. Now, I think the way to understanding what's going on, I'll give you some of these puzzles in just a minute, but Hayek revolutionized the way economists think about markets when he said prices have two functions. They both send some information and they provide a motivation for doing something. So there's the message and the motivation, if you like alliteration, which obviously I do. So just think about the price as conveying information. Now, with Hayek, of course, it was conveying information about how scarce the good really was. And that was his information theoretic revision of market theory, which actually was a very good idea. Now, I want to suggest that things like prices have the same message function. If you find somebody, it may be just a price. Step right up and buy it. It could be a signal, something about the intent of the guy who imposed the price. It could be an insult. And it could also be a teacher. Okay, I'm stretching it with the teacher, but you'll see what I mean. The prices can structure your world in such a way that you learn things you wouldn't otherwise learn. So this is a case in which a fine is just a price. Those of you who know the literature must wonder how I've gone 3 lectures, and this is the first time I've introduced this particular example, because it's such a great experiment. In some Haifa daycare centers, parents are coming late to pick up their kids. And at the beginning of, at some particular time, a fine was imposed. No explanation was given. A little thing outside the door said, as from Monday, parents coming more than 10 minutes late will have to pay 10 NIS shekels to the school. There are two sets. There was a control group, and there's a group with the fine. That's the group with the fine. That's the control group. They're pretty similar here. Then you impose the fine here in week 6, and the group which has the fine doubles the amount of lateness. That's not the only thing you'll notice about it. I mean, it's an extraordinary big effect. Lateness doubled. We'll come back to this. I mean, not surprisingly, after week 17, they forgot it. They'll forget the fine, and things didn't go back to the status quo ante. That's a hint about something which I'll bring up much later. Well, that was just a price. What about a just price? Well, in Ireland, a tax was passed on garbage bags. It was a very small sum, 20 cents in US dollars at the time. It was preceded by weeks of a media campaign about how nasty garbage bags were in the gorgeous Irish countryside and urban landscape. And within 2 weeks after the imposition of the tax, the use of the bags had disappeared, virtually disappeared. Amazing. And the most obvious interpretation that people will give you is that somehow, we don't know how, carrying a plastic grocery bag home from the store got to be a little bit like wearing a genuine fur coat. People were likely to come up to you and say, well, hey, what about that grocery bag? Now, we obviously have to understand why Haifa and Ireland were so different. What was going on whereby, in both cases, a relatively modest incentive had such different effects? Well, I get inspiration from, this will surprise you, seeing I was talking about Benson's duty and interest principle, that is, incentive alignment for the public servant in my first lecture. Here's what he said about punishments. A punishment should be a moral lesson. When by reason of the ignominy it stamps on the offense, it is calculated to inspire the public with sentiments of aversion towards those pernicious habits and dispositions with which the offense appears to be connected, and thereby to inculcate the opposite beneficial habits and dispositions. I think this is exactly right. Notice this is the message idea. Now, does this tell us about why Haifa and Ireland were different? I don't know. It would be fantastic to try to really study that. But I think very important was the publicity, propaganda prior to the tax in Ireland probably had a big impact. And secondly, if you come late to pick up your kid, the only person there is the teacher, most likely, because it was quite rare people were coming late. And when you're shopping in public. If you come late to the daycare, it's always possible it was traffic, no particular decision you made. Perhaps you were careless, but you didn't exactly make a choice to be late. You are making a choice on a plastic bag. So there are all kinds of things that if you think about the processing that people would go through, that in one case they might have acted very positively and the other negatively. A fine, in addition to being a message, can also be an insult. You remember the trust game. There's an investor, and he or she transfers a sum of money to the trustee. The amount is then doubled by the experimenter, and the trustee can transfer back some money to the investor. In both cases, you can do nothing. The first guy can send nothing, or if the second guy gets something, he can send nothing back. Now, the trustee, the investor attempts to control the amount returned, backfired very strongly. And this is a graph which I showed you. These people here, the controlling, the guy said, okay, you have to send back at least 10. Well, these people were all people who'd sent back 0 without the control, and then they sent back 10 when it was required. All these people apparently had been voluntarily giving 10, and they also gave 10 once it was required. All of these people reduced the amount that they gave after the imposition of the fine. Here's another example from a similar game that I think will allow us to extract another possible reason for this. That just said insult. It's obvious that the people were asked about what do you think about this controlling your behavior, and people said it's a sign of distrust. But this is a game, same game, but I think we get a different answer from it. Think about how Homo economicus would play this game. It's the same game as like one I just described. Well, if I'm the investor, I might guess what kind of person you were. But if I guessed that you also were Homo economicus, it's clear what I would do. I'd give nothing, because if you were Homo economicus, you'd give nothing back. So that's the way the game should be played. What happens, in fact, is that if you give a lot, you get a lot back. There's a lot of reciprocity in this game. And this is some examples of this. When there's no fine possible, those are the gray bars. When the fine is possible and it's not used, those are the white bars. And the black bars are when the fine is used. Let me explain the white bars. They had so I'm the investor, and Brian is the trustee or the respondent. And he knows that I could fine him if he didn't give stuff back. I renounce the fine. I actually have to make a choice. He knows I made that choice, and then I give him, $7 or something. Now, this is how much the investor transferred, and that's the back transfer. The vertical height of the bars is a measure of reciprocity, or rather, the slope of the response to larger amounts is the measure of reciprocity. It's obvious that the fine backfired, in the sense that you got less reciprocity in the case of the fine. But what's really obvious is that being able to do the fine and not doing it was the best of all. That's the white bars, right? So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the use of the fine was saying something about the character of the individual, and being able to fine but not using it was a clear message that I'm an okay kind of guy. Let's see if we can milk that particular case for a little bit more juice. Oh, can you milk something for juice? Milk for something, sustenance. Squeeze it for more juice. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm going to think about this. It's probable, I think, that incentives per se are not the culprit here. There's something else going on. Here's why I think that. Do you remember this game? This is a public goods with punishment game. You remember how that's played? It's just an n-person prisoner's dilemma in which after each contribution, people can punish those, although we would never use such a word, who had contributed low. This is what happens when there's punishing going on. People contribute a lot. People punish a lot, and people respond very positively to the punishment. Take away the punishment, and down it goes. It unravels. Here's the case I just gave you. What's the puzzle? Well, in both cases, there are fines being imposed. In one case, the fine works like a dream. People respond very positively. And we know econometrically, the experiments I've done with this game, you have a huge response to getting fined in the previous round. A lot of learning goes on. Why is that game different from that game? Well, let's think about it. In the first case, that is in the public goods game, particularly in the stranger treatment, that's when you will not be playing with the same people next round. If I punish you for a low contribution, I can't possibly benefit. I'm just being civic-minded, or maybe I'm, a lot of possibilities, but the most obvious one is I'm punishing you because I think you violated some norm. I'm not going to benefit. Whoever plays with you next will benefit, but not me. In the trust game, the incentive was being posed by a principal who stood to benefit if the incentive worked. In other words, it was a profit-maximizing situation. I was so interested in whether or not that really was the case, I was able to actually look at the kinds of responses that people got depending on how much they asked back or otherwise they'd get fined. Here are the results here. Suppose you divide the investors into two groups. Some people said, here's $10, and I want you to give me back whatever number it is so that I would get all the surplus, or almost all of it. And some other people said, here's $10, I want you to give me back at least this amount, which if you give back, we'll split the surplus equally. So there were two kinds of investors, obviously the fair ones and the unfair ones, in the minds of the respondents, I guess. And all of the crowding out was in the first case. This 8% of crowding out was not statistically significant different from zero. So that's a little clue. It says that basically what's going on here is not that the incentives are crowding out, it's that the incentives, when they signal greed on the part of the investor, are the problem. Fines are also teachers. I mentioned this thing here. Why did the behavior persist after the incentive was withdrawn? The most obvious answer is that you learned something in the game that you didn't forget when the game was over. And when I say learn something, I mean generically that, like we learn preferences. So in other words, I think the answer to this is, why do we have this? It may be that we have endogenous preferences. Okay, what's the difference between framing and endogenous preferences? Remember on the first lecture I said some preferences are situation dependent, in the sense that they're subject to cueing, framing, and so on. Endogenous preferences are different in the sense that if your preferences are endogenous, you learn a new set of preferences and then you continue with them for some period of time. I'll exaggerate by saying they're irreversible, whereas situation-dependent preferences are such that if you take away the frame, you go back to your behavior prior to that. There's lots of experimental evidence like this. The behavior persists after the incentives go away. I don't think that's really super fine evidence for endogenous preferences because people adopt their preferences over a long period of time through socialization very often. Our experiences as adolescents is very important. The likelihood that we would actually observe endogenous preferences in an experimental situation is pretty remote, I think. But there are certainly lots that look like this. Now we find other things that are a little more like it. For example, bike messengers around the world are paid in different kinds of contracts. Some are paid by, some are actually formed in cooperatives, and some are paid by normal kind of piece rate-like contracts. Well, it turns out that the preferences of people in these jobs are very, very different. Now you may think they probably select into those jobs, but that's probably not true because the localities in which this test was done, if you're going to be a bike messenger, you have no choice. You can't choose the co-op as opposed to the capitalist bike messenger firm. And the form of the contract had was very strongly covaried with the degree of cooperativeness in ultimatum games and public goods games. Or what about Mechanical Turk and the trolley? I'm sure you want to know what that's about. Okay, well, you go on Mechanical Turk and you do a job. Well, somebody designed a compensation scheme on Mechanical Turk. These were sort of proofreading type jobs on Mechanical Turk. And there are two contracts. One contract was you get paid basically in proportion to how much you do. And the second one was a winner-take-all contract, what's called a tournament in economics. And these people didn't even know they were an experiment, obviously. They got on there and they had these terms. And they should have said, fine. They also then were given the trolley case, probably like the prisoner's dilemma game. It's something I don't have to explain. There's a trolley coming down the track, and if you push somebody off in front of the trolley, you can save 5 lives. Of course, you took 1 life. And then the question is, as you get farther and farther from the tactile act of pushing somebody to a switch and so on, you're still going to save 5 people at the cost of 1. People make different decisions. It's a very standard problem in philosophy and actually it's used now also by neuroscientists to try to get at what's going on when we make these either consequentialist or deontological decisions about actions. Well, it turns out that which contract you worked under had a very big impact on how you decided whether you'd push the guy off or not, or whether you'd pull the switch and so on. Now, why is that? I have no idea, and I can assure you the author of this paper doesn't either. It's not me, by the way. It's a very nice paper, and I don't think he's in the room. But it's a fantastic demonstration that the task performance, the kind of activities you do, may have an effect on some message that you get in an apparently unrelated area, like pushing somebody in front of a trolley. I'm going to pass by this. But I think better evidence for endogenous preferences is this. Look at cultures around the world that are very distinct in how they make their living, the kinds of economic structures they live under, and ask how they play differently. Here we have, these are whale hunters. Those are the lamellera up there. These are herders. That's the orma right there. I'll come back to them in a minute. These are these Amazonian horticulturalists. This is the payoffs to cooperation as we measured in their ecology. How valuable would it be to be able to cooperate? Obviously a lot in hunting a whale, and not that much if you're a slash and burn horticulturalist in the Amazon. Here we have the offers in the ultimatum game, a measure either of generosity or a belief in the fair-mindedness of the respondent, or some combination of both. Rather strong positive relationship here, extremely robust, by the way. I tried to make that relationship go away econometrically, and it won't go away. It's definitely there. It's a normalized regression coefficient of about 0.6, so that's a large number. So what it suggests is how people make their living makes a big difference in how they cooperate. Of course, I would like to airdrop some of the Lamellera into the Amazon and see how they turn out after a couple of generations, but so far I haven't been able to get approval for that. There are many other studies which come to the same conclusion. Some of them are empirically extremely persuasive. An early paper by Bacon et al. On economic structure and child rearing. You'll see the quote, "Knowledge of an economy alone would enable one to predict with considerable accuracy whether a society's socialization pressures were primarily towards compliance or towards assertion." Another one, almost exactly the same subject, child rearing values in modern industrial societies. You want to predict them? Okay, you can all take guesses about what's going to predict them. Religion, education, income, whatever. You want to know the thing you should have said? You should have said whether you give orders on the job or whether you take orders on the job. It's a very powerful predictor of whether you want your kid to be independent or obedient. And finally, big differences between pastoralists and farmers. These are East African ones in the value of independence based on the way they make their living. And I mention this one because everybody at some point says, now wait a second, are you sure that people aren't selecting into these jobs and that's where you're getting your correlation from? Well, this one by Edgerton very nicely did a correlation not only between whether you're a pastoralist or agriculturalist and your values. He said, forget what you are. Let's just look if you live in a place where you could be a pastoralist or an agriculturalist. That is, he used an instrumental variable, as we call it in economics, based on the geography to predict the same thing. And remarkably, the correlations were only marginally reduced. So this is a very powerful finding which deals with that endogeneity problem. Now, how can we understand what's going on? I'm telling stories, right? I want to convince you that this is really happening, that economies produce goods and services and they also produce people, and therefore how you use incentives in an economy is going to be an important part of what people turn out. What can we do about this in terms of actually modeling? Well, there are models of cultural evolution. Boyd and Richardson pioneered this field, and there are now a lot of models, including some by economists. The basic idea is this: an economy determines who you meet to do what with what rewards. That affects essentially which kinds of people are going to be doing well. If you model that, you find out, not surprisingly, that when you have institutions that reward self-interest highly, or that give little reward or scope for other rewarding preferences, which make it hard to do that, that will contribute to the proliferation of selfish traits, as long as the cultural copying, is what it's called, is responsive to payoffs or responsive to the distribution of types in your experience. Now, so I think the idea here is that if you organize a society along certain lines, you're likely to have cultural consequences of the type that I've mentioned. In saying why I thought that Adam Smith's argument for the beneficial effects of trading on the behavior of merchants might not be adequate, I made the argument that Smith's case for the probity of the merchant was based on the idea that you have a very primitive kind of market in which people have endless contact with the same individuals. You don't have a modern market where you have what I called anonymity and ephemeral contact. If you did, his model wouldn't work, and neither would any of the game theoretic models about why we get cooperation among selfish individuals because of repeated games. That all requires that this game be ongoing, and other things like the reputation arguments would give you the same consequence. So to summarize very briefly, because I want to move on to the discussion portion of the flight, the argument here is if you made markets work the way the textbooks in economics say they ought to work, you would destroy their capacity to produce the cultural attributes that make markets possible. Got it? That's the one-liner. Now, by the way, I don't know if that's true, but that's the argument. That's what I'm trying to say. There's a famous thing in economics called the second best theorem, half a century ago, and it's a remarkable idea. It says, suppose you're in an economy in which there are some conditions for efficient allocation of resources, and suppose a couple of them, 3 or 4, are violated. For example, suppose in some industry price is not equal to marginal cost, and suppose in some other industry there's environmental pollution. Correcting one of those may make things worse rather than better. That's all it is. That's all the argument. That's the theorem. That is, fixing one violation of an efficiency condition doesn't mean you move in the right direction. Now, I have a second best theorem. It goes like this. Where contracts are incomplete and hence norms may be important in attenuating market failures, public policies and legal practices that more closely approximate the idealized complete contracting markets may exacerbate the underlying market failure by undermining socially valuable norms such as trust and reciprocity, and may result in a less efficient equilibrium allocation. In other words, getting a little closer to the goal isn't necessarily a good idea, and I think I've given you some evidence that it may actually be a pretty bad idea. Well, what about incentives? It's easy to misunderstand what I'm saying, to think that I think incentives are bad. Not at all. They work very well for lots of jobs which people would not like to do, and in which the incentive can be designed in such a way as to avoid conveying bad information about the principle. These are some puzzles that I would like you to have in your minds. I would like to hear more from you if you have research ideas in these areas. But here's what I think now. Framing is what accounts for the fact that mechanisms appealing to self-interest often implement exactly the Nash equilibrium. That is, they do exactly what the economist says, as if people were selfish, but in the absence of that incentive, people don't act as if they're selfish. I think framing is a good explanation for that. I don't know if it's, now, it's also the case, because of endogenous beliefs and preferences, that the apparent adverse effects of incentives may sometimes persist for over long periods of time. Because of information about intent, remember the trust game and so on, it sometimes is the case that fines work positively, sometimes they work negatively. And here's an interesting question. Why are these counterproductive incentives so widely used? They've got to be good for something. They're good for profits. Remember in the trust game, the ones who are taking back a large part of the surplus were doing very well. And in many of these experiments, what's done by the experimenter usually is it tells you what happens to the social surplus, that is the winnings of both sides. They almost always go down. That's what it's meant by counterproductive. But often the incentive can shift the pie to the principal and away from the agent. Okay, well, here's what we're now turning to the question of what would be the optimal amount of the incentive, and I won't go on much about this. Obviously, more Ireland, less Haifa. We've got to design these institutions so that they're complements rather than substitutes. We have to now determine what the optimal level is. And here's a surprise. If you have crowding out, you may want to use incentives more rather than less. That surprised me. In fact, I thought I'd made a mistake. There's a theorem in one of my papers about this. I just couldn't believe that. I was pretty dumb when I finally realized how the theorem worked. Of course, it's true that crowding out can sometimes induce the sophisticated legislator not to use the incentives or to use fewer of them. But it's also true that in many situations, the opposite holds. So Titmuss thought that we shouldn't use incentives because they affect crowding out. That's sometimes true, but it's not always true. And you can think of lots of cases in which it wouldn't be true. Where crowding out is categorical, so that, for example, the very presence of an incentive turns you off, but then if you crank it up high enough, you respond to it, well, you can see then that that might be a situation in which you might have to use more incentives rather than fewer. Or think about this case. You've got a target compliance problem. At least 80% of the population has to get first aid training. And the sophisticated legislator tells you that, oh, by the way, the incentive you're going to use doesn't work very well. Are you going to use more of it or less of it? Well, if you're going to use it at all, you'll use more of it. You might decide to abandon the target. But aside from that, this is almost penultimate. I want to say something about economics. In economics, preferences are a summary of what people do. They say nothing about motives. That's a big innovation of the last half century in economics. Action is acquisitive. We get stuff. I think both of these are mistaken. We have to understand that I say we, I'm now for the first time in these lectures speaking as an economist. We have to understand motives. Other disciplines understand this. They talk about the reasons why people do things. This may be a misunderstanding for those of you who are, sort of just consumers of economics on the side. Preferences are not a reason why somebody does something. It's just a consistent description of what that person will do under some conditions. I think we need to go back to the old-fashioned classical notion of preferences as reasons why we do things, motives, and then start to explore what those motives might be. When we do that, we're going to have to contrast two modes of thinking about action. One is getting and the other is being. The conventional economic approach is we do stuff in order to get stuff. Now, by stuff, by the way, I don't mean anything stupid like it has to be material. We try to minimize the disutility of our effort. We care about time preference and so on. But we're acquiring, basically, as opposed to the constitutive aspect of behavior in which we're trying to be someone either in our own eyes or in the eyes of others. I think, and this is just a speculation, that this particular, you may think, rather speculative and ill thought out idea, acquisitive constitutive, may be the right road to go down in trying to understand why we get these surprises and these unintended effects. By way of summary, I think what we've found here in the 3 lectures is that individuals are heterogeneous, some selfish, some not, very many different kinds of types of behaviors. Versatile, very responsive to situations, able to act one way or another, and plastic, change under the influence of changing social circumstances. Incentives are messages as well as motivation. Because we have multiple beliefs about others, we have multiple beliefs that may be self-fulfilling. Remember in the trust game, the ones who are distrusting, they put the limit on how much you could give, and of course those people acted selfishly. So I said that's self-fulfilling, but also the ones who didn't act that way also had their beliefs fulfilled. In most policy situations, we're facing a possibility of multiple equilibria. And so the job of the sophisticated legislator is not simply to inch some equilibrium in the right direction, a little greener or something, but actually to choose amongst equilibria. It's called equilibrium selection in economics. There are lots of examples of this, but I think it would take too long there are lots of little examples I can give you from experiments in which a small change in design changes you from one equilibrium to the other. Not invasive, it wouldn't violate any principles, it just is a way of moving from one possible outcome, which is self-sustaining, to another. And so, back to Aristotle, or a constitution for knaves, or both or neither. Here's my Hume's knave statement, updated a little bit, not as nice as the way Hume wrote it. The task of the policymaker is to devise rules so that in cases where cooperation is socially desirable, other regarding preferences will be sustainable in a cultural equilibrium, and individuals with other regarding preferences will have opportunities to express their prosociality in ways that induce all or most to cooperate, as in the public goods with punishment experiments. Notice, we're looking at heterogeneous populations here. In the case where the thing went collapsing like that, probably a small number of selfish individuals were driving that. They started contributing little and everybody else got angry at them. Just the same, when they sustained the cooperation, it could have been a small number of civic-minded people who were punishing others. So for all we know, looking at that data, I haven't looked carefully at it, but just looking at the gross data, it's pretty obvious that it could be that a small number of civic-minded people sustained a very cooperative equilibrium, or a small number of selfish people drove that population to a rather unpleasant equilibrium. This, of course, raises lots of interesting questions. Liberal neutrality is, of course, something which is much debated what it means, but the kinds of intervention in the formation of values that I think would be valuable to undertake in a society would probably violate some notions of liberal neutrality. Now, by the way, I'm not suggesting that we should engage in something which we are not now engaging in. If what I've said is correct, it's not the case that governments and other organizations are now refraining from intervening in your preference formation and your values. They do it all the time. I'm only advocating it's something which a democratic society should talk about rather than having essentially hidden by the assumptions of economics and other areas. Thank you very much.